Consuming RESTful Web Services. Now that we've laid a bit of a primer for our two buckets of web services, SOAP and REST, let's take a look at RESTful services and consuming them in the context of Mule. Now, one of the first things that we'll do when we're entering a system, say we're connecting to Box or Salesforce or SAP, we'd want to go in and see if a pre-existing connector exists. We can search inside of Studio and in the Anypoint Exchange for connectors that are not included in Studio to see if that system already has a predefined building block we can use. Now, in cases where there's not, and there is a REST-based API defined, we can use the HTTP request connector. This request connector is actually brand new in 3.6, and it has a lot of great features that make this new age of REST-based calls much, much easier. We'll need to create the connector, specify the host port, optionally a base path for where the API is exposed. And then for the endpoint in our flow, specify the path and method that we'd like to access. So in this walkthrough, we're going to create a second flow and rename that particular flow. We're going to add an HTTP listener connector endpoint in to receive all requests, this time on a specific path labeled United. Secondly, or lastly, we're going to add an HTTP connector endpoint to consume a RESTful web service for United flight data, which, as you can see in this screenshot, should come inside of JSON. Let's get started. First things first in this walkthrough, we want to go into a web browser or HTTP API testing tool in order to make sure that we can call the service. Once inside of the web browser or tool such as Postman, let's go ahead and make a request to this particular endpoint. Now you'll find this endpoint in your student files in the snippets guide for the REST call. In this case, I'm going to be calling localhost 808112//united/flights. So localhost 8112 essentials United flights. Keep in mind your mileage might vary. You want to check your student files to see what endpoint you're going to be hitting exactly. Now, sending a request to this has produced JSON for me. So in this case, by scrolling through, I can see that there is an array of flights in JSON that came back. I can see the airline, the price, departure date, and a bunch of information about all these United flights to note all of these different destinations. So far, so good. Now, how can we do something similar in our Mule applications in calling these? Well, let's go into Anypoint Studio and check this out. Starting off in Anypoint Studio, we're going to go into our AP Essentials project and open up our pre-existing AP Essentials XML file, if it's not already. Now, as a reminder from last week, we set up this AP Essentials flow, where we put in some expressions for hello world, and it gave us some basic data back, learned a little bit about properties and variables along the way as well. Let's introduce a second flow to this particular application. In doing this, let's go into our search box in the palette, type in HTTP, and in this case, we're going to drag in another HTTP element. Now keep in mind, when I drop this here, I've dropped in an HTTP connector, which has created an HTTP connector endpoint, specifically a listener endpoint. Now, before we configure this guy, let's also take a look at our global elements. So by going into global elements here, remember that we've got this existing HTTP listener configuration. And in opening up this listener configuration and just taking a look at it, we can see that it's binding to all of our interfaces on port 8081. So based on our requirement for this walkthrough, this actually should work just fine. The only specific thing we need to do is specify that the endpoint in our new flow should be accessible on /United. Now, we wouldn't want to put this here because this would affect all of our HTTP listener endpoints that reference this configuration. So for now, let's hit cancel, go back to our message flow, and start off by referencing this connector config. So our HTTP listener configuration looks pretty good, as we saw. The specific thing that we do want to change here, though, is we want to make sure that this is accessible on United. While we could leave allowed methods blank, let's make sure that only GET requests come in, because we don't want data being posted to this flow, at least not right now. So we'll type in get. Now that we've got this HTTP endpoint created, we're looking pretty good, but we need an outbound request to our service. What we'll do to accomplish this is bring in another HTTP connector, and this time by dropping it in the process box, it's going to make a requester connector endpoint. So contextually, it knows it's going to be an outbound request in this case. Now you'll notice when you drag this in, it's asking for a connector configuration. And if we drop down this box, there's nothing available, because while we've made a listener global element, we haven't actually created a requester global element, which will act a little bit differently. So let's click the add button here to create a new connector for the requester. And now let's specify where we want to access this particular call from. So in this case with our requester, if I flip back into Postman for just a moment, I can see inside of Chrome here that this is the request that I made when I was showing you an initial service. So let's use the path that we tested with here to configure our global connector. Remember, your host and port may vary depending on what's in your student files. In Anypoint Studio, I'm going to paste in the host. And what I'll do here is I'll clean it up a little bit. I'm going to take out our HTTP beginning. Let's also take out our path subsequent and the port. So essentially just localhost. 8112 is going to be the port that we access this call on. And then as far as our base path is concerned, we basically want to take everything after our particular host. So Essentials United Flights. And you'll see soon how this URI can be extended on to make this call successful. So let's go ahead inside of our properties view, hit OK, and then back inside of our properties view here, we basically have the ability to extend the URI or URL we're calling and say what method we want this requester to use. Let's start off by setting just a path of root, so we don't want any additional path details here. And if we drop down the method box, you can see all of the HTTP methods available. This, being a safe operation to receive data, is going to be a get method. All right, so far so good. Now before we run our project, let's make sure that our flow is named something appropriately. So what we can do here is right-click on our flow, go to rename, and let's go ahead and call this flow Get United Flights Flow. It'll be important that we keep our names consistent and constantly updating throughout our creation of this project, as we're going to have many more flows as this class continues. I'll click outside of here. We can see Get United Flights Flow. I'm also going to save the project up, so take a moment to save everything together, and let's go ahead and run this project. Once our application is successfully deployed, let's go out and test it with a web browser or tool such as Postman. In this case, inside of Postman, I'm going to call a much simpler address. As you might recall, you've exposed your endpoint on localhost 8081/United. And this should, in short, produce the request we were seeing earlier. So let's test it out. When we click send, it goes through Mule, and we can see here that we're getting, again, JSON data back inside of Mule. A little bit more condensed this time, so let me flip over to the JSON switch so we can see it easier. But we can see flights, the collection with all of the data inside of it, and essentially Mule is now facilitating this RESTful call, and we designed this all inside of Anypoint Studio.